Hey everyone, welcome to the PowerPoint for Module 9.2.2. In this, we're going to start our discussion on sensory pathways, get a little bit more in depth than the first PowerPoint in this unit. So we'll start off with what actually a sensory pathway is. So when talking about a sensory neuron that delivers sensations to the CNS, it's called a first-order neuron. And the cell body of a first-order general sensory neuron is located in the dorsal root ganglion or the cranial nerve ganglion. In the CNS, the axis of that sensory neuron synapses on an interneuron known as a second-order neuron, which may be located in the spinal cord of the brainstem. If the sensation is to reach our awareness, the second-order neuron synapses on the third-order neuron in the thalamus. And somewhere along its length of the axon, the second-order neuron crosses over to the opposite side of the CNS, and as a result of that, the right side of the thalamus receives sensory information from the left side of the body, and the left side of the thalamus receives sensory information from the right side of the body. And the reason for this crossover is unknown. Although it has no apparent functional benefit, crossover occurs along sensory and motor pathways in all vertebrates. So the axon of the third-order neuron then ascends without crossing back over and synapses on neurons of the primary sensory cortex of the cerebral hemisphere. And as a result, the right cerebral hemisphere receives sensory information from the left side of the body, and the left cerebral hemisphere receives sensations from the right side of the body. So somatic sensory pathways carry sensory information from the skin and muscles of the body, the wall, the head, the neck, and the limbs. And we'll consider three major somatic sensory pathways: the spinothalamic pathway, the posterior column pathway, and the spinocerebellar pathway. And these pathways are made up of pairs of spinal tracts symmetrically arranged on opposite sides of the spinal cord. All of the axons within the tract share a common origin and destination. Note that the tract names often give clues to their function. For example, if the name of the tract begins with spino, the tract should start in the spinal cord and end in the brain. It must therefore be an ascending tract that carries sensory information. The rest of the name indicates the tract's destination. Thus, a spinothalamic tract begins at the spinal cord and carries sensory information to the thalamus. If, on the other hand, the name of the tract ends in spinal, the tract ends in the spinal cord and starts in a higher center of the brain, and it must therefore be a descending tract that carries motor commands. The first part of the name indicates the nucleus or the cortical area of the brain where the tract originates. And for example, the cortical spinal tract carries motor commands from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. And we'll consider such tracts later on throughout this PowerPoint. So the spinothalamic pathway. The spinothalamic pathway carries sensations of poorly localized touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. And this pathway includes small tracts that deliver sensations to the reflex centers of the brain or in the brainstem, as well as larger tracts that carry sensory destined for the cerebral cortex. And we'll ignore the smaller tracts in our discussion here. Sensations bound for the cerebellar cortex ascend within the anterior spinothalamic tract or the lateral spinothalamic tract, and these tracts end in third-order neurons in the ventral nucleus of the group of the thalamus. After the sensations have been sorted and processed, they are relayed to the primary sensory cortex. And the perception that an arriving stimulus is painful rather than cold, hot, or vibrating depends on whether second and third-order neurons are stimulated. The ability to localize that stimulus to a specific location in the body depends on the stimulation of an appropriate area of the primary sensory cortex. Any abnormality along the pathway can result in an inappropriate sensation or an inaccurate localization of the source. And consider these examples when talking about that. So a person can experience painful sensations that are not real. So for example, a person may continue to experience pain in an amputated limb, and this phantom limb pain is caused by activity in the sensory neurons or in the interneurons along the spinothalamic pathway. The neurons involved were once part of the labeled line that monitored conditions in the intact limb, and these labeled lines and pathways are developmentally programmed. And for this reason, even people born without limbs can have phantom limb pain. So a person that can feel pain in an uninjured part of the body when the pain actually originates in another location. For example, a strong visceral pain sensation arriving at a segment of the spinal cord can stimulate interneurons that are part of the spinothalamic pathway. And activity to these interneurons leads to the stimulation of the primary sensory cortex, so that the individual feels pain of a specific part of the body surface. And this phenomenon is called referred pain. One familiar example of that pain is of a heart attack, which is frequently felt in the left arm. And women may experience pain in the jaw, the neck, the shoulder, the stomach, or the back. Another is the pain of appendicitis, which is generally felt first in the area around the navel and then in the right lower quadrant. So the posterior column pathway carries sensations of precise touch and vibrations and proprioception. The spinal tract involves are the left and the right fasciculus gracilis and the left and right fasciculus crenatus. On each side of the posterior median sulcus, the fasciculus gracilis is medial to the fasciculus crenatus. The axons of the first order neurons reach the CNS within the dorsal roots of the spinal nerves and the sensory roots of the cranial nerves. The axons ascending within the posterior column are organized according to the region innervated. Axons carrying sensations from the inferior half of the body ascend within the fasciculus gracilis and synapse in the nucleus gracilis of the medulla oblongata. Axons carrying sensations from the superior half of the trunk, the upper limbs, and the neck ascend in the fasciculus cuneatus and synapse in the nucleus cuneatus. Axons of the second order neurons of the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus ascend to the thalamus. As they ascend, these axons cross over to the opposite side of the brainstem. The crossing of an axon from the left side to the right side or from the right side to the left side is known as decussation. Once on the opposite side of the brain, the axons enter the tract called the medial liminus. So as it ascends, the medial lemniscus runs alongside the smaller tract that carries sensory information from the face, relayed from the sensory nuclei of the trigeminal nerve. The axons in these tracts synapse on the third order neurons of one of the ventral nuclei of the thalamus. And these nuclei sort the arriving information according to 1, the nature of the stimulus, and 2, the region of the body that's involved. Processing in the thalamus determines whether you perceive a given sensation as fine touch, pressure, or vibration. And our ability to localize the sensation to determine precisely where on the body the specific stimulus originated depends on the projection of information from the thalamus to the primary sensory cortex. Sensory information from the toes arrives at the medial end of the primary sensory cortex, and information from the head arrives at the lateral end. When the neurons of one portion of your primary sensory cortex are stimulated, you become aware of sensations originating at a specific location. If your primary sensory cortex were damaged or the projection fibers were cut, you could detect a light touch but would be unable to determine its source. The same sensations are reported whether the cortical neurons are activated by axons ascending from the thalamus or by direct electrical stimulation. Researchers have electrically stimulated the primary sensory cortex in awake individuals during brain surgery and asked the subjects where they thought the stimulus originated. The results were used to create a functional map of the primary sensory cortex known as the sensory homunculus. In a sensory homunculus, the body features are distorted. For example, the face is huge with enormous lips and tongue, but the back is relatively tiny. And these distortions take place because of the area of the sensory cortex devoted to a particular body region is proportional to the number of sensory neurons in that region, not to the region's absolute size. In other words, many more cortical neurons are required to process sensory information from the tongue, which has tens of thousands of taste and touch receptors, than to process sensation from the back, where the touch receptors are few and far between. The spinocerebellar pathway conveys information about muscle tendon, joint positions, and from the spine to the cerebellum. This information does not reach our awareness. So the axons from the first order sensory neurons synapse on interneurons from the dorsal gray horns of the spinal cord. The axons of the second order neurons ascend in one of the spinocerebellar tracts, the posterior spinocerebellar tracts, or the anterior spinocerebellar tracts. The sensations carried by the anterior spinocerebellar tracts reach the cerebral cortex by the superior cerebellar peduncle. Interestingly, many of the axons that cross over and ascend to the cerebellum then cross over again within the cerebellum, synapsing on the same side as the original stimulus. The functional significance of this double cross is unknown, though. The information carried by the spinocerebellar pathway ultimately arrives at the Purkinje cells of the cerebellar cortex. Proprioceptive information from each part of the body is relayed to a specific portion of the cerebellar cortex. Motor commands issued by the CNS are distributed by the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, better known as SNS and ANS. The somatic nervous system, also called the somatic motor system, controls the contractions of skeletal muscles. The output of the SNS is under voluntary control. The autonomic nervous system, or visceral motor system, controls visceral effectors such as smooth muscle, cardiac muscle glands, and adipocytes. And our interest here is in the structure of the SNS, and throughout our discussion here, we'll use some of the terms motor neuron and motor control to refer specifically to somatic motor neurons and pathways that control skeletal muscles. Somatic motor pathways always involve at least two motor neurons, an upper motor neuron whose cell body lies in the CNS processing center, and a lower motor neuron whose cell body lies in the nucleus of the brainstem or spinal cord. The upper motor neuron synapses on the lower motor neuron, which in turn innervates a single motor unit of the skeletal muscle. Activity in the upper motor neuron may facilitate or inhibit the lower motor neuron. Activation of the lower motor neuron triggers a contraction in the innervated muscle. Only the axon of the lower motor neuron extends outside of the CNS. Destruction of or damage to a lower motor neuron eliminates voluntary and reflex control over the innervated motor unit. Conscious and subconscious motor commands control skeletal muscles by traveling over three integrated motor pathways: the cortical spinal pathway, the medial pathway, and the lateral pathway. The basal nuclei and the cerebellum monitor and adjust activity within these motor pathways. The output of these centers stimulates or inhibits the activity of either. 1, the motor nuclei, or 2, the primary motor cortex. The cortical spinal pathway, which is sometimes called the pyramidal system, provides voluntary control over skeletal muscles. This system begins at the pyramidal cells of the primary motor cortex. And the axons of these upper motor neurons descend into the brainstem and spinal cord to synapse on lower motor neurons that take control of skeletal muscles. In general, the cortical spinal pathway is direct. The upper motor neurons synapse directly on the lower motor neurons. However, the cortical spinal pathway also works indirectly as it innervates centers of the medial and lateral pathways. And the cortical spinal pathway contains 3 pairs of descending tracts. 1, the corticobulbar tracts, 2, the lateral cortical spinal tracts, and 3, the anterior cortical spinal tracts. And these tracts enter the white matter of the internal capsule, descend into the brainstem, and emerge on either side of the midbrain as the cerebral peduncle. A little bit about the corticobulbar tracts. The axons in the corticobulbar are the brain stem that kind of tracks synapse on lower motor neurons, and in the motor nuclei, cranial nerves, which include 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 11, and 12. The corticobulbar tract provides conscious control over skeletal muscles that move the eye, the jaw, the face, and some of the muscles of the neck and the pharynx. The corticobulbar tracts also innervate the motor centers of the medial and lateral pathways. A little bit about the cortical spinal tracts. Axons in the cortical spinal tract synapse on the lower motor neurons in the anterior grain horns of the spinal cord. As they descend, the cortical spinal tracts are visible along the ventral surface of the medulla oblongata as a pair of thick bands, also known as the pyramids. Along the length of the pyramids, roughly 85% of the axon crosses the midline to enter the descending lateral cortical spinal tracts on the opposite side of the spinal cord. The other 15% continue uncrossed into the spinal cord as the anterior cortical spinal tracts. Then, at the spinal segment and its targets, an axon in the anterior corticospinal tract crosses over to the opposite side of the spinal cord in the anterior white commissure. The axon synapses on lower motor neurons in the anterior gray horns. A little bit more about the motor homunculus you see over here to the right. The activity of the periodontal cells in the specific portion of the primary motor cortex results in the contraction of specific peripheral muscles. Which muscles are stimulated depends on the region of the motor cortex that's active. As in the primary sensory cortex, the primary motor cortex corresponds point by point with specific regions of the body. And the cortical areas have been mapped out and diagrammed here that you see on the right, creating a motor homunculus. The proportions of the motor homunculus are quite different from those of the actual body because the area of the primary motor cortex devoted to a specific body region is proportional to the number of motor units involved in the region's control, not to the region's actual size. And for this reason, the homunculus indicates the degree of fine motor control available. For example, the hands, the face, and the tongue are all capable of varied and complex movements, so they appear large. In contrast, the trunk is relatively small, and these proportions are similar to those of the sensory homunculus. The sensory and motor homunculi differ, however, with respect to some other areas of the body. For example, some highly sensitive regions, such as the sole of the foot, contain few motor units. Also, some areas with an abundance of motor units, such as the eye muscles, are not particularly sensitive. So several centers in the cerebrum, the diencephalon, and the brainstem may issue somatic motor commands as a result of processing performed at a subconscious level. And these centers and their associated tracts were long known as the extrapyramidal system, or the EPS. It was thought that they operated independently of and in parallel with the pyramidal system. And this classification scheme is both inaccurate and misleading because motor control is integrated at all levels through extensive feedback loops and interconnections. Instead, it's more appropriate to group these nuclei and tracts in terms of their primary functions. So the components of the medial pathway help to control gross movement of the trunk and the proximal limb muscles, and those of the lateral pathway help to control the distal limb muscles that perform more precise movements. The medial and lateral pathways can modify or direct skeletal muscle contractions by stimulating, facilitating, or inhibiting lower motor neurons. Note that the axons of the upper motor neuron in the medial and lateral pathways synapse on the same lower motor neurons innervated by the corticospinal pathway. This means that the various motor pathways interact not only within the brain through connections between the primary motor cortex and the motor centers of the brainstem, but also at the level of the lower motor neuron through excitatory or inhibitory interactions. So the medial pathway. The medial pathway is primarily concerned with the control of muscle tone and gross movements of the neck, the trunk, the proximal limb muscles. The upper motor neurons of the medial pathway are located in the vestibular nuclei, the superior and inferior colliculi, and the reticular formation. The vestibular nuclei, located at the border of the pons and the medulla, receive the information over the vestibulocochlear nerve. This nerve has receptors in the internal ear that monitor the position and the movement of the head. These nuclei respond to changes in the orientation of the head, sending motor commands that alter the muscle tone, extension, and position of the neck, the eyes, the head, and the limb. The primary goal is to maintain posture and balance. The descending fibers in the spinal cord constitute the vestibular spinal tracts. The superior and inferior colliculi are located in the tecum, or the roof of the midbrain. The superior colliculi receive visual sensations, and the inferior colliculi receive auditory sensations. Axons of the upper motor neurons in the colliculi descend to the tecospinal tracts. These axons cross to the opposite side immediately before descending to synapse on lower motor neurons in the brainstem of the spinal cord. Axons in the tecospinal tracts direct reflexive change in the position of the head, the neck, the upper limbs in response to bright lights, sudden movements, or loud noises. The reticular formation is a loosely organized network of neurons that extends to the brainstem. The reticular formation receives input from almost every ascending and descending pathway. It also has extensive interconnections with the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem nuclei. Axons of the upper motor neurons in the reticular formation descend into the reticular spinal tracts without crossing to the opposite side. The region stimulated determines the effects of reticular formation stimulation. For example, the stimulation of upper motor neurons in one portion of the reticular formation produces eye movements. The stimulation of another portion activates respiratory muscles. A little bit about the lateral pathway. The lateral pathway is primarily concerned with the control of muscle tone and the more precise movements of the distal parts of the limbs. The upper motor neurons of the lateral pathway lie within the red nuclei of the midbrain. Axons of upper motor neurons in the red nuclei cross to the opposite side of the brain and descend into the spinal cord in the rubrospinal tracts. In humans, the rubrospinal tracts are small and extend only to the cervical spinal cord. There, they provide motor control over distal muscles of the upper limbs. Normally, their role is insignificant as compared with that of the lateral corticospinal tracts. However, the rubrospinal tracts can be important in maintaining motor control and muscle tone in the upper limbs if the lateral corticospinal tracts are damaged. So the basal nuclei in the cerebellum are responsible for coordination and feedback control over muscle contractions. Those contractions can be consciously or subconsciously directed. The basal nuclei provide the background patterns of movement involved in voluntary motor activities. For example, they may control muscles that determine the background position of the trunk or the limbs, or they may direct rhythmic cycles of movement as in walking or running. These nuclei do not exert direct control over lower motor neurons. Instead, they adjust the activity of upper motor neurons in the various motor pathways based on the input from all portions of the cerebral cortex, as well as from the substantia nigra. The basal nuclei adjust or establish pattern of movements by two major pathways. One group of axons synapses on the thalamic neurons, whose axons extend to the premotor cortex, the motor association area that directs activities of the primary motor cortex. This arrangement creates a feedback loop that changes the sensitivity of the pyridymal cells and alters the pattern of the instructions carried on by the corticospinal tracts. And two, a second group of axon synapses in the reticular formation, altering the excitatory or inhibitory output of the reticular spinal tracts. And two distinct populations of interneurons exist in the basal nuclei. One that stimulates neurons by releasing acetylcholine, and another that inhibits neurons by releasing gamma-aminobutyric acid. Under normal conditions, the excitatory interneurons are kept inactive, and the axons leaving the basal nuclei have an inhibitory effect on upper motor neurons. In Parkinson's disease, the excitatory neurons become more active, leading to problems within the voluntary control of movement. If the primary motor cortex is damaged, the person loses fine motor control over skeletal muscles. However, the basal nuclei can still control some voluntary movements. In effect, the medial and lateral pathways function as they usually do, but the corticospinal pathways cannot fine-tune movements. For example, after damage to the primary motor cortex, the basal nuclei can still receive information about planned movements from the prefrontal cortex and can perform preparatory movements of the trunk and the limbs. But because the corticospinal pathway is inoperative, precise movements of the forearms, the wrists, and the hands cannot occur. An individual in this condition can stand, maintain balance, and even walk, but all movements are hesitant, awkward, and poorly controlled. The cerebellum monitors proprioceptive sensations, visual information from the eyes, and vestibular sensations from the internal ear as movements are underway. Axons within this spinocerebellar tracts deliver proprioceptive information to the cerebellar cortex. Visual information is relayed from the superior colliculi, and the balance information is relayed from the vestibular nuclei. The output of the cerebellum affects upper motor neuron activity in the corticospinal, medial, and lateral pathways. All motor pathways send information to the cerebellum when motor commands are issued. As the movement proceeds, the cerebellum monitors proprioceptive and vestibular information, comparing the arriving sensations with those experienced during previous movements. It then adjusts the activities of the upper motor neurons involved. In general, any voluntary movement begins with the activation of far more motor units than is required. The cerebellum acts like a brake, inhibiting the number of motor commands used for that movement. The pattern and degree of inhibition comes from the moment to moment, making the movement efficient, smooth, and precise. The patterns of cerebellar activity are learned by trial and error over many repetitions. Many of the basic patterns are established early in life. Examples include the fine balancing adjustments you make while standing and walking. The ability to fine-tune a complex pattern of movement improves with practice until the movements become fluid and automatic. Consider the relaxed, smooth movements of acrobats, golfers, and sushi chefs. These people move without thinking about the details of their movement. Think about what happens when you concentrate on voluntary control of various movements. The rhythm and pattern of movement usually falls apart as your primary motor cortex starts overriding the commands of the basal nuclei and cerebellum. And lastly, I want to talk about a little bit of the levels of processing and motor control here. All sensory and motor pathways involve a series of synapses, one after the other. Along the way, the information is distributed to processing centers operating at the subconscious level. Consider what happens when you stumble. You often recover your balance even as you become aware that a problem exists. Long before your cerebellar cortex could assess the situation or evaluate possible responses. So, like shift weight here or move my leg here, and so on and so forth to keep from falling, and issue appropriate motor commands. Monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflexes, perhaps adjusted by the brainstem and the cerebellum, successfully prevent your fall without you having to actually think about it. This is a general pattern. Spinal and cranial reflexes provide rapid, involuntary, pre-programmed responses that preserve homeostasis over the short term. Voluntary responses are more complex and require more time to prepare and execute. Cranial and spinal reflexes control the most basic motor activities. Integrative centers of the brain perform more elaborate processing. So as we move from the medulla oblongata to the cerebral cortex, the motor patterns become increasingly complex and variable. The primary motor cortex of the cerebral hemispheres directs the most complex and variable motor activities. And during development, the spinal reflexes and cranial reflexes first appear. More complex reflexes and motor patterns develop as CNS neurons multiply, enlarge, and interconnect. The process proceeds slowly as billions of neurons establish trillions of synaptic connections. And at birth, neither the cerebral nor the cerebellar cortex is fully functional. And centers in the diencephalon and brainstem primarily direct the behavior of newborn infants.